Hi, everyone. In this video, since we know that biology is the study of life, we're going to talk about what is meant in terms of being a living organism. So, biology has many different levels of organization, ranging from the atomic level to the biosphere. And uh, most cases, when you end up working in the life sciences, you tend to pick one of the organizational levels or multiple of them, depending on the specialty that you end up doing. And in my case, my preferred one is cellular and molecular, like this up to like here. It all depends on one's preference and what they want to work with. And when we look into what is a living organism, what we know is that they share 5 fundamental characteristics, and that includes energy, being derived of cells. They can replicate and evolve and store and transmit information throughout generations. So we're going to talk more about these different characteristics of being a live organism, and what the first one is energy. This means that all organisms can acquire and use energy to get all of the different processes up and running. So why do organisms actually need energy? Because when you look at these different processes, like here, we need to sort out aspects of um, different biological processes, where it's like getting energy to get things moving, get things working and functioning properly. Now, the next one is the idea that all organisms are made of membrane-bound cells. And here we can see different types of cells. This one here is an animal cell. This one is a plant cell. And this is a bacterial cell. We'll talk more about like structures in general. However, what all of these cells have in common is that they are membrane bound, that it is an individual unit of many different organelles, which we'll talk soon enough. But just kind of a heads up, where if you see like a scale bar here, these lines and these numbers, those are called scale bars, and these are telling you how magnified it is. So if we have one um micron, this is micrometer or microns, and if you look at 1 micron versus 0.25 micron, in this case the eukaryotic cells or the animal and plant cells are typically of the state that is being bigger than the bacterial or prokaryotic ones. Or in this case, the bacterial cell is so much smaller than what you would see with the eukaryotic cell. So now one thing to keep in mind is to keep in mind the size of different living organisms and how they can vary in terms of size with each other. So like a virus is smaller than a chloroplast, but it's tinier than like a frog egg. Like, um, enzymes would be like in between here, depending on what we're looking at, you know? Like with these, like it would be smaller than a mouse, but then uh, plant cells would be like smaller than a frog egg, but then it's bigger than like proteins and stuff like that. So the next aspect of this involves being able to replicate or be able to reproduce. The first type of reproduction is sexual reproduction, where it can go through the process of like meiosis and fertilize. Like it involves two adult parents, and it will lead to that future offspring. The next part is called asexual reproduction, where it does not require two, but just one parent just to kind of keep on dividing and just uh, form the future offspring. So, like in this case with bacteria, it can be through the process of bacterial fission. But then with like some cases, it could be like budding or mitosis. And then we have some organisms that just do both. They can do sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So a question could be like, in which type of reproduction, sexual or asexual, are the offspring identical to their parents? And in this case, the answer would be asexual reproduction. And now we kind of branch off into the next uh, aspect of being a living organism, which involves evolution. And this is essentially the process of that allows them to evolve depending on what environment you are in. And one prime example that we love to use in biology is Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. So these finches, they arrived from the mainland from about 2 million years ago. And each of the different islands, they had different food sources. And whichever finch had the best traits that allowed them to eat the food available in that area actually survived through a process called natural selection and produced the more offspring. So essentially, the successful traits ended up being favored and became more common over the following generations, that the finch population in that island evolved and kind of took over that area. And now there are currently 13 different species that are differentiated by their beak size and like their songs and feeding behaviors that they have. So like these finches here, where they have like different types of beaks, different islands ending up with different uh, types of finches. This kind of brought on the idea of more like natural selection and evolution, where these both can occur when populate individuals in that population end up varying in their heritable traits. These are traits that are inherited throughout the generations when we're doing like replication and reproduction and all that. So variations in these traits end up occurring through random mutations within a genome. And what happens is that with the individuals in that environment with the most optimal heritable traits within for that environment will survive through natural selection more than the others with less optimal uh, traits. And what will happen is that it will survive through natural selection and produce more offspring compared to the other organisms. And throughout the generation, the frequency of the optimal trait ends up increasing. And what happens is that the population itself evolves to include these new characteristics. So when we think about natural selection, it's more on the individual rather than a whole evolutionary change in the population. Now that kind of brings me to the next part where we look at um, information and how organisms actually use the hereditary information that are encoded in our genes or like any organism's genes to kind of respond to different stimuli or like any um, thing that is affecting you in through like different receptors and sensors. So in like this case, it's like this plant where they kind of move towards the sunlight because the sunlight is in a different direction. And this kind of like these auxin molecules, they kind of help them grow in the direction of where the sun is. So that kind of increases the rate of cell replication and elongation, letting that plant bend towards the light itself. This is another example of plants responding to different aspects of the environment, different stimuli, where the sunflowers or the plants are moving in the direction of the sun itself. This is also called heliotropism. They're trying to, it's like their internal clock moving with it as these genes in it are regulating it depending on what stimuli is around it. This is another example where this little sensitive plant called mimosa, or in other countries it's known as the touch me not plant, where it when you touch it, it starts folding up like uh, this example here. And this is essentially a protecting mechanism of the plant itself. That way they look less appetizing to the herbivores that want to eat them, and just make it exposing that it looks like um this to kind of make it less appetizing to any predators that it has. It also helps protect the plant when it's exposed to rain, wind, any high temperatures, any changes in your environment. It also kind of helps change the flow in and out of the cells, and it kind of shows that these plants, they can actually determine what's harmful and what's harmless and protect themselves in the process of doing this. Now, in biology itself, we have three central unifying ideas, and these are the following. So, the cell theory itself is stating that it is the fundamental structural unit in all living organisms, and that all cells come from a previously existing cell. So, if we see this, we have cells, it's the functional structural unit of all living organisms. However, when we look at it, it comes from different uh, a previously existing cell. So if it's like one generation, two generation, it goes on from a previously existing cell. Now, the second idea that unifies us in biology is the theory of evolution. And this is that all species are related by common ancestry and have changed over time in response to natural selection, like we talked about. And then there's the idea that is called the chromosome theory of inheritance. Uh, this just means that the cells store information in chromosomes and in the form of DNA sequences called genes, and these genes encode uh, information that allows you to make the products that makes a cell functioning properly. So now, what do we think when we think about viruses? So we have different structures here with these different uh, viruses that we see here. However, the main question that we can think of is, are they actually living organisms? And what do we know about viruses? We know that they are acellular, which means they are not cells. They have no metabolism and cannot grow at all unless they are in a host. And then they can store genetic information in RNA or DNA. Their genetic code can mutate so they can evolve. They can only replicate within host cells and must use host cell machinery and raw materials to make um, viral particles which are released from the host cell. So when we look at viruses, they would not be considered a living organism because they are not cells. They have no energy or metabolism in terms of like on their own. And then they need the host cell to do anything. And so those are kind of like main categories of what is actually happening in a virus. So they wouldn't be actually considered alive. So we're going to talk more about these topics in later uh, videos where we talk more about these aspects um, throughout the session. And I look forward to doing more of this with you guys.